It is an honor for us to have you here and also to have a panel of very distinguished colleagues and representatives as well who will be with us to speak about the importance of facilitating investment planning based on the NDCs. Just as a way of introduction, we have in the panel, we have Carlos Sanchez for CCRI, and I will be asking them afterwards also to engage in the panel discussion. We also have Sada Mohammed from the National Treasury of Kenya. And also here with us, Mrs. Ingvild Solvang from the GGGI. Many thanks all of you for joining. And my colleague Selina Ryder, Head of Policy and Strategy in the GCF, who will be making a presentation as well about investment planning of national determined contributions. Just as an opening for this session, to note as well the increased relevance of investment planning, given the fact that countries have engaged already in the formulation of long-term strategies, nationally determined contributions, NAPs, and instruments as well of planning at the national level that now need to be brought down to the level of implementation. In that exercise, we identify the need as well to support countries in identifying how their climate priorities are backed up by science, by climate evidence, and also how those climate priorities can be supported by different financial instruments. There is a need of an exercise of financial engineering to identify the different sources of finance that can help countries turn those priorities into investments. In that respect, and also in the context of the programming cycle of the GCF for 2023-2027, we are planning as well, based on countries' priorities, what the programming directions of GCF for the next cycle will be. And we were pleased also to introduce to you some of the thinking that is based on the feedback that we have received from different stakeholders. For that, my colleague Selina Ryder will make a presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Carolina. I'm also going to stand up. Maybe it will make my voice louder because somehow, even though the place is emptying, it seems very noisy behind us. And if we can bring the presentation up as well, that would be great. The other thing, because we have a small group today, is I think it would actually be useful to have a conversation, nice to have a conversation with our panelists. If you're able to react to our ideas as well on NDC investment planning, the topic for today. So just to, once the TV screens come up, very briefly introduce the GCF's approach. As you will know, we're an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, and we're mandated to support developing countries in implementing their NDCs and also to drive paradigm shift. And on the screen, you'll see our theory of change for promoting paradigm shift. So supporting countries in actual transformational planning, how they translate their NDC through their national development planning systems into climate investments, catalyzing innovation, de-risking early investment and greening finance. And of course, for today, we're focused on pillar number one, how do we actually make that first step of transformational NDC planning. So what's our overall ambition? Well, thinking about our role, ultimately we want to see every developing country being able to have the capacity to actually translate its NDC, its national adaptation plan, its long-term strategy into really a program of country-owned climate investments, which sounds like a simple ambition, but as we've found out, and hopefully we'll get some reflections on today, may not be as simple as it seems. So the first thing I wanted to go through is show you a couple of results from our recent global programming conference, where we actually invited all of our country partner focal points, as well as the accredited entities to Songdo. And this is just a couple of slides which show the survey we did at the conference, which show that the capacity gaps in actually doing NDC implementation investment planning are quite significant. And you'll see these range all the way from, in terms of designing a climate investment, does the country actually have that climate information at the appropriate scale? Have they been looking at that and actually analyzing that to understand the hazards and the vulnerabilities in the scales and at the regional level where the projects might be done? And then a critical one, which showed up quite high here, having the actual capacity, the expertise, the people on the ground to turn that assessment into an actual diagnosis, so into an understanding of then how to create investments, how to make those financial decisions. Likewise, investment planning, engaging investment partners, and then the actual drafting of the concept notes and funding proposals all came up as still pretty significant gaps with our country partners. So then a few reflections, I guess, from GCF's investment experience. So we know that countries have the need to actually further build the capacities for NDC investment planning. What we're also then seeing from our experience so far, we've been programming for about 7 years now on the investment side, is that there could be benefits in terms of getting to investments faster, of moving from the incremental approach, which is what we've been seeing, to a more systemic approach, which we know is also what the IPCC calls for. So again, it's a very simple visualization, but the left-hand side tends to show the approach we're seeing now, where we do get sort of, let's call them standalone projects with a climate risk assessment, the feasibility studies that underpin the funding proposal, the structuring done on a case-by-case basis. One of the challenges we've seen here is these often come back and forward between the Green Climate Fund and the country and the accredited entity quite frequently, because we're actually trying to fill some of those gaps already when we're at the funding proposal stage. Where we see the opportunity, I guess, in more systemic investment planning is that if we can get the climate studies done, if we can get the identification of options done, the identification of financial sources done as part of the planning process, then there's an opportunity to actually structure these programs of investments that are then able to move more rapidly to full funding. And that ultimately is what we want, to be able to get investment on the ground faster. So this is a little bit of a, we call this the snake diagram, a bit of a graphical representation of how we, in a simplified way, see the stages in the investment planning process. It is not a one-way snake. The reason it's wiggly is because we do see there being feedback cycles between these different steps. But really moving all the way from, I guess, the highest level of NDC and NAP planning, which is sort of the national development planning, budgeting, maybe identifying the sectoral priorities at a relatively high level, and the socioeconomic analysis that goes along with that. Through this stage of then downscaling that understanding of the climate risks. So getting a really more granular understanding of how is climate change going to impact different regions, different communities, different sectors, and being able to design the right options, mitigation and adaptation to respond to that. That then leads into the investment planning. So what sources of finance are available out there? How can the different sources of finance be matched to those programs of investments in a way that ultimately attracts the most possible finance for the developing countries' ambitions and NDCs, whether that be private, whether it be through policy de-risking, whether it be through public financiers such as ourselves, or whether it be partially through a government on-budget contribution. And then finally, that leading into the actual proposal development and approval process, and of course, where everyone wants to be in project implementation. Now, one thing that we just wanted to highlight here is, of course, that the GCF operates a readiness program. It's actually probably the world's biggest capacity building program for climate change. And it can actually support countries through all of the stages of this process. Goodness, that's really loud. But we see a particular opportunity for it to come in at stages 2 and 3, which is where we see some of the biggest capacity gaps at the moment. And we will be bringing a new readiness strategy to our next board meeting at B35, which looks at some of these issues. I won't go into the next slides in much detail, but this again, it's the same graphic, but with a sense of how our different support modalities come into support. So readiness and our PPF, and then our accredited entities. And the idea being if we can move towards more streamlined windows to provide that support. So I just thought I'd end with a couple of more concrete examples of how we're taking this forward. We had a very exciting launch and event last week with Egypt of the Egypt's investment plan. Eduardo, our colleague in the audience here, was working really hard on this all the way through this year. And we hope that that will be an example of how countries can engage with GCF through this investment planning process. We're really just at stage one. We're continuing to work with the Egyptian government and partners over the coming year to more fully refine that into a stage two, more detailed investment plan. And the second example I'm going to give, hopefully I'm not giving too much of a preview of Carlos's intervention, is the Jamaica pilot, where we're looking at, again, similar application of this approach through basically a climate assessment tool, identification of options, and then matching sort of green and grey infrastructure to address those risks that have been identified. So we're definitely piloting and applying this approach in very concrete ways, but I think that is the point at which I'll stop. I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, and hand back to you, Carolina, and our panelists also to share their experience of the NDC implementation and investment planning process. Thanks.
Many thanks for that, Selina, for providing this presentation that offers food for thought and also for further planning when it comes to investment planning. That is an area that is emerging, and I know that several partners were working along the same lines, and we're aiming to coordinate increasingly as well, so we can provide clearer guidance on how investment planning can help bring down the NDCs and the LTS down to the level of implementation, as mentioned by Selina. And many thanks, Selina, also for indicating how this is taking place in the context of GCF and in collaboration with partners, and for identifying also the different stages that can help us move from the identification of priorities in NDCs to the level of concrete investments. In this respect, it will be helpful as well to hear from our panelists who are here representing as well the government. We have the colleague from Kenya, Mrs. Sada Mohammed, as well. And we would also like to hear the perspectives from international organizations and from other partners, and we'll move to that afterwards. But first, I would appreciate to hear from you, Mrs. Sada Mohammed. What are the main challenges, also reflecting on the presentation that was just made by Selina, the main challenges for the government to prioritize and foster increased investment? Thanks.
Thank you very much for the questions. Yes, my name is Sada Mohammed. I am an economist. I work for the National Treasury, which is the NDA focal point for the GCF in Kenya. So I'll be sharing our experience as Kenya and our engagement with the GCF. So yes, in terms of prioritization of government, yes, there are a lot of challenges. Number one, because most of our governments, the developing country governments, are already crippling with issues of development needs and also what to prioritize in different sectors. So, and that is also marked with the unstable macroeconomic space that we have and the limited resources. So now you're talking about climate change. So how do we bring in climate change and the issues of COVID and the issues of the global crisis on food security and energy issues? So how do we incorporate all this in our development needs? So number one, the issue is, yes, there's the willingness to prioritize climate issues, but we also have other development issues that are ongoing. So that kind of limits the willingness or the inspiration of the government to also look at investment planning or prioritizing climate actions. And then if you look at the issues around the planning part, because so far as a country, I will say for Kenya, we've done a lot of planning processes in terms of having the action plans in place. We have the national adaptation plans, we have the national climate change action plans, which incorporates both adaptation and mitigation. And then we have a focus on the national adaptation plan, which is specifically on adaptation because that's our priority as a country. We also have the NDC between 2020 and 2030. And in our NDC, we are very ambitious in terms of, we've just updated the NDC in 2020, and we are prioritizing, we actually are targeting to abate around 32% of the GHG emission between 2020 to 2030. And we've estimated our needs at $62 billion USD. And with that, we are actually calling, that's actually an indication of the total amount, right? And then we have 87% of that conditional to international support. And that costing is already, there's a disclaimer in our NDC that that costing is not reflective of the current or the actual level of needs that are there, because the issues around methodology, how do we even cost these needs that we've identified in the NDC? And there are actually gaps around methodologies and the metrics used to do that. And specifically to adaptation issues, we also have methodology issues. There's no shared methodology around the countries on how do we cost adaptation needs, how do we report adaptation needs, and all this affects in terms of assessing the balance between adaptation and mitigation. So as a country, with our interaction with the GCF so far, we have a lot of projects, but specifically on mitigation, very few on adaptation, and yet that's our priority in the NDC, it's our priority in the government plans. So that's the challenge. So having that prioritization. But now with the plans, we've tried to mainstream some of those activities in our development plans, both the long-term and the short-term. But the issue is now just identifying the plans. So we've not gone the step of costing those plans and how do we put a figure to it to help us in terms of implementing and also incorporating into our budget process. So that's the challenge. And everything that goes back to capacity again. So yes, we've done the plans, we've mainstreamed, but how do you actually translate those plans into actual projects that can be implemented? So institutional capacity, technical capacity are still there. And I feel like it's an opportunity for the GCF to actually get into this, because one, we have seen Readiness support through GCF that has been actually supporting our country in terms of enhancing capacity and also institutional strengthening. And we see an opportunity here whereby GCF can come in to actually support this. Because one, even in the discussions around the new goal and the delivery of the existing goal, it's all about the needs and priorities of developing countries, and we don't know these needs. And clearly we don't have the capacity to do that. So who is going to help us to do these needs so that we even know as a country and also as government, how much are we investing here in climate and how are we mainstreaming climate in our development process? So that has been the challenge. Capacity, as you said, it's there. And we have a lot of projects at the moment, but we have a direct access entity, for example, that has done one project so far. We have others that are being supported through the development partners. But the issue is at the public institutional level, there are a lot of issues, there are a lot of gaps. And I will urge that, for example, the GCF has had a very good approach in terms of country context and enhancing the country ownership. And if you look at these issues around investment planning, it's more or less top-down approach, bottom-up approach. So it's countries driving the process. And I feel like GCF can actually leverage on that. It's already existing. And we have local institutions that are part of identifying the priorities and also supporting them in terms of costing these needs. So that's what I can say to that question. Thank you.
Many thanks, Sada, for those reflections that signal some of the challenges faced at the country level when implementing climate proposals, building on the priorities identified by the countries. Many thanks also for framing this in the context of the need for this to be considered and mainstreamed into the broader development process for countries, and also the need to support with the costing, to making sure that the methodologies required are in place, and also ensuring that the capacity required as well is built. So this is a country-driven plan for investments on climate priorities. Many thanks for that. That is an excellent segue as well to hear from Ingvild Solvang, Head of Climate Action and Inclusive Development in the Global Green Growth Institute. And the question that I would like you to address is precisely, how can international organizations help enhance the strategic frameworks and institutional capacity of governments to increase the mobilization of climate finance, precisely some of the gaps that Mrs. Sada was speaking about? Thanks.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of GGGI, thank you so much for the invitation to join this panel today. I can speak a little bit to what we as GGGI do to support our members accessing climate finance. Just a little bit of background on GGGI. We are an intergovernmental organization, so we currently have about 45 members. And we have operations in 35 countries now, developing countries and emerging economies mainly. And our mission is to support our members and partner countries in the transition towards green growth in green economies. And we work along the entire value chain from what has been discussed here, this green growth planning, the diagnostics, the potential assessments for where to invest to achieve the greatest outcomes in terms of low emission, resilient and inclusive development pathways. So we also have done quite a bit of NDC enhancement work in partnership with probably several organizations in this room and following us virtually. It's also a nod of appreciation to all the collaboration that is happening in this space. So we work on NDC enhancements with our members and also the long-term low-emission development strategies. Here at COP, we have witnessed the launch of the Tuvalu NDC, which we supported, and also the Vanuatu LT-LEDs was launched here, and we will very, very, very soon have also the launch of the LT-LEDs in Ethiopia and Burkina Faso that we have supported. And along that, we also support the MRV aspect, which I think is really, really the backbone of making sure that we can mobilize climate and green finance to investment opportunities. We are very much aligned with GCF's mission. We are neighbors. We have an office in your building in Songdo in Korea, and our headquarters is in Seoul. I think we may be the largest, or definitely among one of the biggest partners of GCF. And I believe now we have 65 projects, past and present, for readiness and also project preparation support with the GCF. We have leveraged, or we've supported the leverage of $7 billion US dollars, and our current investment pipeline is $9 billion. So we like to think that from every dollar that we receive in technical assistance, money that we can use to support our members, we are able to leverage $15, which is quite ambitious. So that means that indeed the support from the NDCs and really making sure that the measures that are articulated in the NDC are linked back to the science and the projections in terms of where investments need to be to have maximum impact, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation, and the costing of that. So I think in the NDC planning processes and also the LT-LEDs, I think we are in and of itself reducing uncertainties in that process by being very clear on the science, being very clear on the long-term projections for where the country wants to go, and by doing that also signaling very clearly the direction of travel of the country's development process. It is also important to work on the data coordination across different ministries and departments, which in and of itself also increase certainties around these projects. Also factor in climate risks and identify the opportunities to invest in also the resilience components of, for example, energy and agriculture, and in that way also kind of channel finance into adaptation measures, which we are learning more and more are not separate necessarily from mitigation, and finding those co-benefits arrangements between mitigation and adaptation, I think is really key. What we do in Readiness is working exactly with the NDA institution to support the process of how to source and select and approve projects through the so-called no objection process, which is very important. We work on the whole of government principle that we need to raise awareness and build capacity across departments, finding that there is a varying degree, and of course every country is different. I need to state that up front, that the needs and priorities of every country that we work with would be different. But what we see in general is the need to really raise awareness across the different departments of the opportunities that are available within the in terms of mobilizing climate finance. We work on the accreditation of direct access entities with the hopes that more money can go down directly to the countries. That is a big effort in terms of building capacity. there is a lot of substantive work that goes into the actual readiness and having all the systems in place to become accredited, but also capacity to identify projects is really important. So we would really always link, and this is what GCF also encourages, and the way that we are also collaborating with GCF is really the linking of the NDC enhancement work that we do, and all the other strategy documents because the NDC is not everything, right? It's I don't know. I've come to see it almost like the dashboard of a whole range of different strategies, and working really from that to make sure that measures are clear, that the costing is done. We've seen some really great examples, I think, of regional approaches to the NDC enhancement process. I just want to highlight the Pacific NDC hub. I think we saw a very consistent high quality in how the NDCs were costed in the Pacific, and I think that came out of sort of this collaboration between countries and international institutions in the NDC enhancement process that focused a lot also on really making sure that we go from science to target to clearly defined measures and financial planning. So we build also the bankable project pipelines together with our countries and our partners. I think one of the lessons is also the involvement of private sector really early on, and work also on the capacity building of countries on the regulatory environments at sector level for what can really enable the implementation of the opportunities presented in the NDCs. But also importantly, I think there is really focusing and working with the ministries of finance and the fiscal policies that can leverage climate finance, whether that is in terms of taxation or cash transfers or readiness for Article 6 engagements. So GGI also we have a quite large readiness program for engagement on international cooperation on Article 6.2. So I think that those things are also very important. So it's a whole range of services that I think we offer depending on what the readiness needs are. It's a long-term process, I think, step by step all the way until actual implementation. As we know, it takes a long time, and really to make sure that we go through that process and involve all the various stakeholders that are needed to be involved, I think is absolutely what we are learning as we do this. Maybe I'll stop there and then.
Thank you very much, Ingvild, for unpacking the different services and also the different aspects that international organizations such as GGGI can support as countries plan for their NDCs and also the investment planning in the context of the NDCs. We take note as well that there is a broad area that goes from support with MRV to ensure as well that the planning and the investments can be duly monitored afterwards, reported and verified, but also everything that speaks to the capacities at the country level and that are critical for the country ownership as well of these plans. You mentioned as well as something important, climate information and the resilience component as well of NDCs and investment planning. And that's, the best way as well to move ahead to our next panelist, Carlos Sanchez, Executive Director of the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. And we would like to hear from you, Carlos, how can climate science and vulnerability assessments inform the development of NDC investment pipelines? Thanks for your views.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carolina and everyone, for being here, for the invitation. And to your important question, and actually building on the great contribution from Ingvild and Sarah that I'm going to be stealing and reinforcing a lot of what you say, because I think that there is a lot of incredible truth and value in that. And that is, climate science, we were 10 years ago thinking that uncertainty was making things very challenging, that we didn't have the necessary level of certainty and validity on the climate models to translate those into actual decision making. Today, we know that uncertainty is there, but uncertainty is not an excuse anymore, that data is actionable. But what we are learning is that as strong, as valid as a model or an analytical work may be, just throwing a scary map to the desk of an important decision maker, it does not do the job of actually changing the way that decisions are being made. And there are two components that are important there. One is the interpretation of that data in terms of whatever definition of materiality, whatever decision maker we have has, and there are different ways of interpreting that. And the second is about the incentives for decision making that at the end of the day these decision makers are subject to. Within the coalition, we attempt to simplify this to two key decision makers. One is a Minister of Finance / Minister of Planning, and the other is a CIO / CFO. And really spending a lot of time as to why and what do they respond to, apart from believing that climate change is real, apart from believing that that model is real, what will really modify one unit of effort of decision, be it fiscal capacity or be it capital capacity. And starting to answer your question, on NDCs, what we believe is that there is a desperate need for a very particular interpretation of climate risk data for the purpose of informing how national value in its broader definition is exposed to physical climate risk over a relevant time scale. And those we could maybe from this we could extract transmission channels, so social impacts, economic impacts, ecosystem impacts, and the direct and indirect versions of these. Then there is time scale. And time scale is a really crucial one when it comes to climate risk, to understand to what duration you are estimating a certain impact, to what extent you can discount the aggregate exposure of that period to present value. That is another question mark. But it is crucial to articulate time scale, transmission channels, so how climate risk manifests materially to a decision, and also types of hazard that some of them are really challenging. Acute hazards are maybe better understood, but maybe in the shorter term, and chronic hazards are maybe better averaged, and we understand the long term, but then it's very hard to attribute impact from those. So with that complexity, it need to be accepted, then we have to go where Sarah was speaking about the need of not being only bottom up, but also top down. So from an infrastructure, at least standpoint, it is really informing upstream and downstream infrastructure decision making. So enabling prioritization. So understanding in your jurisdiction what are the central locations where the most concentrations of economic, social, ecosystem value are located. It is translating those into projects that have a proven ability to reduce or eliminate those, and it is to prioritize those based on the priorities of the country. So it's an incredible challenge, but it's really something that needs to be attempted if we want to be more holistic and deep in our need to protect value in countries. And I'll finish by sincerely thanking the GCF, because really we couldn't be where we are as a coalition without the support of GCF, that from day one, when the coalition was only an idea, to the implementation, we've been learning so much and walking this path with you, and it is something that really allows us to be quite ambitious and optimistic. So big and sincere thanks in that regard.
Many thanks, Carlos, and we are equally grateful for teaming up in that joint journey. Many thanks, and that's supporting countries along the way. And also, I take note also of some of the comments that you made when it comes to climate risk data, and this is one of the big gaps, also in terms of capacities at the country level, that need to be addressed. And this climate risk data is key for decision making. As you mentioned, that is decision making upstream and downstream, and reaching out to different levels of stakeholders. In that respect, it is evident that capacity building is very much needed. I think the three of you spoke to that, to the different requirements at the country level, also on the side of international organizations, how some of those needs are being addressed, and also when it comes to science and data, also some of the needs and some of the aspects that we have, but also the elements that are still yet to be put in place. Trying to address these needs as well, we have important tools when it comes to capacity building. One of the most powerful tools that we have in GCF is the Readiness program. That is the largest capacity building program globally. The Readiness program is addressing different aspects related to capacity building that go from institutional strengthening, policy development, enabling environments, project development, NAP formulation, knowledge sharing, and they cover a broad spectrum. We're at the moment revising the Readiness strategy. That is a mandate that we have from the board, and the revised strategy is to be presented to the board in March 2023. In this context, the feedback that we receive from those that have implemented projects and from those that have supported readiness requests is critical for us to make sure that we get it right, and that we get it right for countries. My next question is in relation to that, to how can we make more effective readiness support so it has the most value and impact towards NDC investment planning. Your views and reflections will be extremely helpful for us, so we can also take note of those and incorporate in our revised strategy. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. So, as I mentioned earlier, Kenya has been a beneficiary of readiness support besides the project financing. So we've had benefited from 5 so far, and the specific one I'm talking about is the NDA strengthening one, which we are actually, it's a multi-year project, readiness support for 3 years, and we've just started the implementation last year. And from that, you can clearly see that, number one, it's NDA strengthening. So the aim is to build capacity, institutional capacity of the NDA, and also strengthen the country programming process. But you'll see that we are doing beyond just GCF. So we are using that readiness support to streamline our processes in terms of coordinating our climate finance issues beyond how do we access finance beyond GCF. And we find also supporting other, Kenya is also a beneficiary of Adaptation Fund and the JEF, and we also use the same support capacity building the institutions that are supposed to access that. So you'll find it's just leveraging on the GCF readiness to do bigger things. So that's really something that is unique with that readiness. And then we also have the same institution. For example, our direct access entity is also benefited from a readiness and also a PPF. And they're also, because they're building capacity of the institution, and they're also the NIE for the Adaptation Fund. So you'll see the spillovers, yeah? So we are building capacity all around, regardless of which fund you're accessing. So the uniqueness about that, again, is sector specific. For example, we have the readiness for the DAs, and we have the readiness for the NDA. But now when it comes to the NDC itself, for example, in Kenya, I will tell you the mandate for NDC's Ministry of Environment and Forestry. They're the ones who are custodians of policies around climate issues, including the plans and the strategies. So the only reason we came in is because of the financing bit. And the only reason why Treasury came on board, of course, we were participating in the process because it's a stakeholder-driven process. But just the fact that we are an NDA for the GCF gave us that position to contribute to the NDC. So number one, the challenge around now is how do we implement this NDC? So far what we do is in our GCF proposals, we like highlighting that this is in line with our NDC, this is in line with our plans, but the actual contribution of that action or the project to the NDC is what is lacking. Yeah. So I will propose that, for example, look at the, let's say energy. So we just have general areas on energy or intervention areas on energy. But now when it comes to having a project specific to that area, and how do we link to that? So number two, also in terms of the multi-level approach. So in Kenya, we have a national government and we have a local government. And now we are telling the local governments that you also have a role to contribute to the NDCs, but we don't have targets for these local governments. How are they supporting that implementation? So that disaggregation at the two levels is also an issue. So yes, we are supporting the national entities, but a readiness for the local entities is also an approach that I will see. Because as Kenya now, we are promoting locally led climate actions, supporting the local government and the communities to identify and cost these needs. So how about having a readiness also for that subnational level, right? When it comes to costing and also identifying the priority areas. So, and then also looking at the other readiness that have been in place, for example, the one for result monitoring. I know there's a readiness for direct access entities as well. So how do we expand this? There are entities like, for example, the local NGOs that also have the capacity to do some of these good projects, but the modalities of them accessing the GCF is different. So how do we also bring them on board? Because you find them, these are the people actually doing a lot on the ground, working with government and private sector also. So we have an accredited entity and the private sector, but again, because of the private sector component, they don't access readiness, or they don't have a PPF component sort of. So how do we incorporate everyone? Because NDC is everybody. We have a very big sector or a section on private sector activity under NDC. We have the nature-based solutions, and everybody is involved here, the CSOs. And so how do we look at the current readiness approach, and how is it limiting some of these actors to also participate in this? So for me, probably the take home is, how do we package it? So that as we look at NDC, it's everybody, it's inclusive. So we go readiness beyond DAEs and NDAs and look at the other actors who are also in the space, and how do we support them to also contribute, including the subnational level. Thank you.
Many thanks for those insights. Are extremely helpful for us also to inform the evolution of our readiness strategy. I would like to hear from our other two panelists as well, before moving ahead with some reflections and closing remarks. Over to you, Ingvild.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you, Sana, for those. I'll be those great points. I'll be building a bit on what you said. So we have also reflected quite a bit across the different, and as I said, we have 65 readiness and project preparatory support projects going with GCF. So we have had quite a bit of time to reflect, also together with GCF, and we also had a shared publication that we published last year, where we worked our way backwards from looking at the proposal development process and evaluated sort of the strengths and the gaps in capacity for proposal development, and then we worked our way backwards a little bit to reflect on what are the common challenges that we find, and again, of course, acknowledging that every country has different needs and different gaps. And I also actually really want to highlight also that evaluation report that GCF has published on the access of the least developed countries to GCF. I think that was a very good report in terms of highlighting some of those very specific challenges of the least developed countries. So I just want to highlight that as well. But what we also found was that we consistently need to look at the lack of clear finance strategies and coordination capacity. So again, back to the importance of improving the way that we work with our members on the NDC enhancement process, and really building the capacity to link the science with the measures and the actions, and clearly define that, which of course is an important part of also that proposal development. And maybe one of those dreaded parts of proposal development is the climate rationale aspect of resource mobilization that is really, really key. And of course also the MRV component of that, which requires a high degree of technical capacity. And then also working then, as has been mentioned, with the NDA. Of course, the NDA is the one that we are there to support. And I think it's good, the manual for readiness that GCF has, which kind of outlines the types of services that are available to be supported under the readiness program. It's important to look at those and their suitability for each country, and to really come up with terms of references for readiness in each country that really addresses the specific needs that the country has. And then work on bringing into the process the NDA, but also sector and subnational level. I really liked what was just said in terms of sector level, subnational levels, also into the process, because it's essential, and and last but not least, also private sector in that process. We have also already touched upon the second point that we found in our reflection, which is that information asymmetry. Which is really that data may or may not be available. Of course, the lack of data is a big problem in many places, but also data may be available, but nobody really knows where to find it, or it may be sitting somewhere and there is no mechanism for really having flows of information and flows of data between institutions, and also between public and private entities. So that's one of the areas that we really would like think is important to invest in, also moving forward. We have also identified the continued need to support partners with the partnerships between developers and accredited entities. I think that comes down also to a lot of awareness raising amongst private sector and also governments on the potential and what type of climate finance is available and out there. So that's something that we really work on, and also the capacity to develop proposals and follow up on the approval processes is also one of those long-standing processes. And last but not least, again, the development of the pipelines is important, and there we also come in, and in addition to the readiness funds going in that direction, using leverage. I loved what you said, Sada, on the using readiness for great things. You know, it's that leverage that is so important, and I think we can also leverage readiness funds to, for example, GGI has a GGI Korea Trust Fund in-house that we can use to leverage and also support additional components of getting those bankable projects ready. So thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments and that feedback, Ingvild. That's extremely important for us as well as we move ahead. And we'd like to hear also on how to enhance the readiness program effectiveness and efficiency from Carlos Sanchez. Thank you, Carlos.
Yeah, very glad to, and starting by, of course, adding with the long and great list that has been already outlined, but maybe to synthesize a little bit, to embed and install that capacity for self-generation and self-updating on those investment priorities, upstream and downstream. So embedding that capacity within the sovereign to redefine priorities, such as update and regenerate what is that national pipeline of priorities to protect national value from physical climate risk, to then enable the capacity for the interrogation of asset level, which is also quite important in terms of the specific design, individual design for an intervention to be ready to withstand the future state of the world and perform and deliver that national value that is so much needed. Associated to both, of course, there is that analytical, technical ability to handle these toolkits that could be a GIS solution. Having the ability within a government to be able to update analytically, be it with new observations, be it with new geolocations, be it with new or better design data for assets. When we speak about infrastructure, of course, we are talking much more than infrastructure. But when it is about that, there is an incredible need to almost generate new teams cross-departmental that really have that capacity. And then once that is enabled, there are two areas that are absolutely crucial. One is a policy toolkit for systemic resilience investment. So really enable that understanding of what are the policy solutions that could accelerate further the attraction of private capital, but it needs to happen on the basis of a very well-defined benefit function, so that you can adjust the cost function that comes with any policy instrument. And for that to be, you need to have that analytical integrity, so that you can prove that overall that plan will deliver that macro stability, that national value enabling capacity. With this, I'm finishing, is financial innovation. So it's really delivering the understanding and the ability to access different instruments and different vehicles that can further accelerate. For example, could we, on the basis of a robust national resilient investment plan, start talking about aggregating public infrastructure assets and issuing a programmatic sovereign bond for resilience? If we have the analytical integrity behind, you can argue that supporting that portion of the national plan, you're indeed investing in the stability of that country. When it comes to climate, of course, there is much more than climate. So there is a little bit, and maybe a way to finalize and summarize, there is a need of embedding capacity that is end-to-end, that is upstream, downstream, design, financing, and innovation. But I leave it there.
Many thanks, Carlos, and thanks to our three panelists also for their reflections and their comments that have made for a very rich event. Just to mention also in terms of closing remarks that LTS and NDCs, as mentioned also by our panelists, have been formulated and are in place already, and this signal the direction of travel and also signal government priorities and country priorities more broadly. That also embeds country ownership already within the LTS and the NDS, and it's a good foundation as well to move down to investments. Now the critical part is to move to implementation. We have heard of the different elements required for that implementation to move ahead successfully, but we note as well that as part of that, there is a need to work in different dimensions, such as making sure that there is climate information and climate risk data available, that we can effectively as well influence decision-making upstream and downstream, that we have the right methodologies in place. And we have heard also in many other specific elements that have been unpacked in this panel. Something that cuts across all these requirements is capacity building, and capacity building, as just mentioned, needs to be embedded as well in the capacities of the country to sustain implementation of the LTS and the NDCs. One important tool for that is the Readiness program, and we have heard as well that Readiness is a starting point, but it's a starting point that needs to take countries to bigger things, as mentioned by Sada. And I think I would like to use those closing words. We need to make sure that our investment planning and our readiness is effectively enabling countries move to bigger things, addressing climate action and their climate priorities. Many thanks for that, and many thanks to all participants, both in here and also online. We hope that this panel has been useful, that the session has been useful, and please allow me to thank our panelists and give them a hand. Thank you. Thank you all.